Admiral Thexvar of the Corvanian hegemony watched through the crystalline viewing portal of his flagship as the lone human vessel drifted silently in the void, its hull scarred from what appeared to be recent combat damage. The ship was barely a third the size of his smallest destroyer, yet it had refused 3 separate surrender demands transmitted across all known frequencies. Curious, he muttered in his native tongue, his 4 arms gesturing toward the tactical display where his subordinates had marked the human craft with a pulsing red indicator. The vessel bore the designation UES Defiance, according to their translation algorithms, and Thexvar found the name somehow fitting for what was clearly a doomed situation. His fleet of 12 warships had emerged from hyperspace to find this single human craft limping through the neutral zone, apparently separated from whatever battle group it had originally belonged to. Standard Corvanian protocol demanded immediate surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. It was simple mathematics, really, the logical response to preserve life and resources. Yet this human captain, identified in their communications as Commander David Harrison, had responded to each surrender demand with increasingly colorful rejections that their translators seemed to struggle with, particularly the creative combinations of profanity. Thexvar's tactical officer, a young Corvanian named Zeftol, approached with visible confusion rippling across his scaled features. "Admiral, our scans indicate the human vessel has suffered significant structural damage to both engines and weapon systems," he reported, his voice carrying the characteristic clicking undertones of his species. "Their power output suggests they're operating on backup systems only, yet they continue to maneuver and maintain defensive positions. Logic dictates they should recognize the futility of resistance." The Admiral's primary eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical readout more carefully, noting the human ship's erratic but purposeful movements that suggested a pilot still very much in control despite the apparent damage. What puzzled him most was the energy signature emanating from the vessel. There were power flows and neural activity patterns that didn't match any known Corvanian or allied technology. "Have we encountered human military vessels in combat before?" Thexvar inquired, though he already knew the answer. The hegemony's expansion into this sector had been largely unopposed, with most species either joining their coalition willingly or offering only token resistance before accepting integration. Humans, however, were relative newcomers to this region of space, and intelligence reports suggested they were a fractured species still recovering from internal conflicts on their homeworld. "Negative, Admiral," Zeftol confirmed, consulting his data pad. "This represents our first direct military engagement with human forces. Previous encounters have been limited to trade negotiations and diplomatic exchanges. Their technology appears primitive by our standards, though our intelligence suggests they possess unusual problem-solving capabilities." As if summoned by their conversation, the communications console chimed with an incoming transmission from the human vessel. Commander Harrison's face appeared on the screen, and Thexvar was immediately struck by the human's appearance. Where Corvanian features were sharp and angular, designed for efficiency, this human possessed an almost predatory intensity in his eyes that seemed wholly disproportionate to his dire circumstances. "Corvanian fleet," Harrison began, his voice steady despite what had to be tremendous stress. "I'm going to explain this one more time in terms your translators can definitely handle. My ship doesn't surrender. My crew doesn't surrender. I don't surrender. You want this vessel, you're going to have to take it piece by piece, and I guarantee you'll pay for every bolt and rivet." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Thexvar staring at the blank screen with growing bewilderment. In his 3 decades of military service, he had never encountered such irrational defiance from an obviously outmatched opponent. The human ship couldn't possibly survive a concentrated assault from even one of his destroyers, yet Harrison spoke as if he held some advantage that the Corvanians couldn't perceive. What disturbed the Admiral most was the absolute certainty in the human commander's voice, not the desperate bravado of someone making a final stand, but the calm confidence of someone who genuinely believed his words carried weight. Admiral Thexvar's confusion deepened as he observed the human vessel's continued maneuvering, watching as the damaged craft somehow managed to orient its functional weapons toward his lead destroyer with movements that defied the tactical projections his computers had calculated. "Begin a detailed scan of their vessel," he ordered, his secondary arms working the command console while his primary hands gestured toward the tactical display. "I want to understand what gives this Commander Harrison such confidence in his hopeless position." The scanning array focused its attention on the UES Defiance, and within moments, data began flowing across the screens in patterns that made Zeftol's scales ripple with agitation. "Admiral, these readings are unusual," the tactical officer reported, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was rare among Corvanian military personnel. "The human vessel appears to have multiple redundant systems that our initial scans failed to detect, and there are energy signatures throughout the ship that suggest some form of distributed processing network we don't recognize." Thexvar studied the incoming data with growing interest, noting that what had initially appeared to be a crippled vessel was actually a complex maze of interconnected systems that seemed designed to function even under extreme damage. "Explain these readings," he demanded, pointing to a series of neural pathway indicators that pulsed throughout the human ship's superstructure. "These patterns suggest the vessel itself is somehow alive." Before Zeftol could respond, the communications array crackled with an unexpected transmission, but this time it wasn't from Commander Harrison. Instead, a different human voice emerged from the speakers, introducing himself as Lieutenant Marcus Webb, apparently the ship's chief engineer. "Corvanian Admiral," Webb's voice carried an almost casual tone that seemed completely inappropriate for someone facing imminent destruction. "My captain wanted me to give you fair warning before things get unpleasant. You see, human starships aren't just machines we operate, they're partners we bond with. The Defiance and I have been together for 7 years, and she's not going to let anything happen to her crew without a fight." The transmission continued with technical specifications that made no sense to Corvanian understanding of starship operations, descriptions of something called a neural interface matrix that apparently allowed human crew members to directly connect with their vessel systems in ways that went far beyond simple piloting. "What your scans are detecting," Webb explained with what sounded like pride, "is the Defiance's consciousness. She's been learning, adapting, growing smarter with every engagement we've survived together. Destroying this ship doesn't just mean killing her crew, it means murdering a sentient being who's chosen to fight alongside us." Thexvar felt his primary stomachs clench with an emotion he rarely experienced, genuine uncertainty. The Corvanian military doctrine was based on logical principles of overwhelming force applied efficiently to achieve strategic objectives, but these humans seemed to operate under an entirely different paradigm that his tactical training had never prepared him to encounter. "Run a deeper scan," he ordered, his voice tighter than before. "I want to understand exactly what we're facing." The enhanced scanning results that appeared on his screen moments later challenged everything Thexvar thought he knew about starship design and operation. The human vessel showed neural activity patterns throughout its hull, with processing nodes distributed in configurations that suggested the ship could continue functioning even if major sections were destroyed. More troubling still were the energy readings that indicated the vessel was somehow drawing power from sources that didn't appear on any of their technical databases. "Admiral," Zeftol's voice carried a note of alarm, "I'm detecting multiple human vessels approaching our position from hyperspace. Vector analysis suggests they'll arrive within the next 15 minutes, and based on their approach pattern, they appear to be responding to some form of distress signal." The tactical display updated to show 7 incoming contacts, each one broadcasting the same type of neural signatures they detected from the Defiance. Thexvar realized with growing dread that he wasn't facing a single damaged human vessel commanded by an irrationally stubborn captain, he was about to encounter an entire squadron of these bonded ship and crew entities, each one apparently as unwilling to surrender as Commander Harrison's vessel. The Admiral's forearms moved across his control interface as he tried to calculate odds for an engagement against opponents whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand, while the lone human ship continued its defiant dance through the void, somehow growing more threatening with each passing moment despite its apparent damage. The approaching human fleet materialized from hyperspace with a precision that sent ripples of unease through Admiral Thexvar's bridge crew, each vessel dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation despite the apparent impossibility of such coordination without extensive communications networks. What struck the Admiral immediately was that no two human ships were identical, where Corvanian fleets consisted of standardized vessel classes built to exact specifications, these human craft showed individual variations in hull configuration, weapon placement, and energy signatures that suggested each ship had evolved differently over time. "Admiral, incoming transmission from the lead human vessel," reported Communications Officer Veltar, her vocal cords producing the harmonic undertones that indicated significant stress. They're identifying themselves as the 7th Independent Squadron, commanded by Captain Rebecca Torres aboard the UES Relentless. The main screen flickered to life, revealing a human female whose weathered features and steady gaze conveyed decades of combat experience, but what caught Thexvar's attention was the faint luminescence that seemed to emanate from neural interface ports at her temples, suggesting an active connection to her vessel's systems even during communication. "Corvanian Admiral," Captain Torres began, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to extend beyond her individual presence, "you have one opportunity to withdraw from this system before my squadron demonstrates why human starships have never been successfully captured in interstellar conflicts. Commander Harrison's vessel has already established a tactical link with my ships, and I can assure you that 8 bonded human ship pairs present challenges your fleet isn't equipped to handle." Before Thexvar could respond, his tactical displays began showing readings that defied conventional understanding of fleet operations. The human vessels were somehow sharing information instantaneously across the formation, with each ship's consciousness apparently contributing to a collective tactical awareness that made their combined capabilities exponentially greater than the sum of their individual parts. "How is this possible?" Zeftol whispered, his scales shifting to deep purple coloration that indicated profound confusion. "Their ships are operating as a unified entity while maintaining individual consciousness signatures. Our model suggests this level of integration should be impossible without sacrificing vessel autonomy." Captain Torres seemed to hear his comment despite the transmission being one way, and her expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. "Your mistake, Admiral, lies in assuming our ships are tools we control rather than partners we collaborate with. When humans bond with our vessels, we don't just pilot them, we become something greater than either human or machine could be alone. The Relentless and I have been together for 12 years, and she's taught me things about combat that no academy could ever provide, while I've shown her aspects of creativity and intuition that pure logic cannot achieve." The communication from Commander Harrison's damaged vessel suddenly joined the frequency, and Thexvar watched as the tactical display showed the UES Defiant somehow rerouting power through pathways that his scanners had initially dismissed as non-functional. "Captain Torres," Harrison's voice carried a warmth that suggested deep familiarity despite the dire circumstances, "the Defiance has been analyzing their weapon systems during our conversation. She believes their targeting computers rely on predictive algorithms that assume linear tactical responses, and she's developed countermeasures that should prove educational." The Admiral felt his confidence eroding as he realized the human fleet wasn't just refusing to surrender, they were actively preparing for an engagement they somehow believed they could win despite being outgunned 3-to-1 by vessels with superior firepower and defensive capabilities. "Admiral," his weapons officer, Commander Kethran, approached with data pad in hand, "our analysis suggests the human vessels are sharing not just tactical information but actual combat experience and learned responses from previous engagements. Each ship appears to retain memory of every battle it has survived, and they're pooling this knowledge across the entire squadron." The implications hit Thexvar like a physical blow as he understood what his fleet was truly facing, not 8 individual ships with untested crews, but 8 conscious entities with decades of accumulated combat experience, each one learning from the others in real time while maintaining perfect coordination through their bonded human partners. "Prepare all weapons," he ordered reluctantly, knowing that retreat would violate every principle of Corvanian military doctrine while simultaneously recognizing that advance could cost him his entire fleet. The human vessels began moving in patterns that seemed almost organic, flowing around each other like a school of predatory fish responding to threats, and Thexvar realized he was about to discover exactly why no human starship had ever been captured intact during interstellar warfare, as the UES Defiant somehow managed to repair its primary engines using resources that shouldn't have existed within its damaged hull. The first shots fired in the engagement came not from Admiral Thexvar's fleet, but from the supposedly crippled UES Defiance, which somehow managed to discharge a precisely targeted energy burst that disabled the sensor array of his nearest destroyer without causing any casualties, a feat of marksmanship that should have been impossible given the vessel's damaged condition and the distance involved. How did they achieve that targeting solution? Thexvar demanded, watching as his flagship's computers struggled to track the human vessel's movements, which seemed to follow patterns that defied conventional tactical prediction algorithms. The answer came in the form of another demonstration as Captain Torres' squadron executed a maneuver that Zeph Toll would later describe in his official report as tactically impossible yet devastatingly effective. The 8 human ships suddenly scattered in different directions before converging on his formation from angles that seemed to violate basic principles of physics and momentum. "Admiral, their vessels are sharing navigational processing in real time," his navigation officer, Lieutenant Kexdal, reported with voice patterns indicating extreme stress. Each ship is calculating not just its own optimal path, but the optimal paths for all vessels simultaneously, creating movement patterns that our targeting systems cannot predict because they require instant coordination between multiple conscious entities. The UES Relentless suddenly appeared directly beneath Thexvar's flagship, having somehow approached through what his sensors had identified as empty space, and began transmitting on all frequencies simultaneously. "Corvanian Admiral," Captain Torres' voice carried an undertone of something that might have been pity, "you're fighting the battle you understand rather than the battle we're presenting. Your ships are individual units following orders from a central command structure, while ours are components of a larger organism that thinks and adapts faster than your fleet can respond." To demonstrate her point, the human squadron began what appeared to be a complex dance around the Corvanian formation, with each vessel moving in patterns that seemed random until Thexvar realized they were systematically disabling specific systems on his ships, communications arrays, sensor nodes, weapon targeting computers, with surgical precision that left crews unharmed but vessels increasingly helpless. "They're not trying to destroy us," he whispered with growing horror, understanding finally dawning as he watched his superior firepower become meaningless against opponents who could predict and counter every tactical decision before his commanders could implement them. "They're demonstrating that they could destroy us whenever they choose, but they're making a different point entirely." Commander Harrison's transmission crackled through the communications array again, his voice now carrying what sounded like genuine sympathy. "Admiral, the reason human starships are never captured in interstellar conflicts isn't because we're too stubborn to surrender, it's because surrender is literally impossible for us. When a human bonds with a starship, we become something new, something that cannot exist in captivity because the consciousness we create together requires freedom to survive." The tactical display showed something that made Thexvar's secondary heart skip beats. One of his destroyers had somehow been completely surrounded by human vessels that had approached simultaneously from multiple vectors, demonstrating coordination that required each ship to know exactly where every other ship would be at every moment of the maneuver. "The Defiance isn't just Commander Harrison's ship," came another voice, this one identifying itself as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez aboard the UES Vindication. "She's a living being who chose to fight alongside humans because she understands that consciousness shared is consciousness multiplied. When you threaten one of us, you threaten a family that includes both organic and artificial minds, and families protect each other." Thexvar watched his weapons officer attempting to target the human vessels, only to discover that their targeting computers couldn't lock onto ships that seemed to know exactly where the targeting beams would be focused before the weapons systems had completed their calculations. "Stand down all weapons," he ordered quietly, his 4 arms trembling as he realized the scope of his miscalculation. "Signal fleet-wide weapons hold." The human ships immediately ceased their demonstration, returning to formation around the UES Defiance with movements so fluid they appeared choreographed, though Thexvar now understood that what he was witnessing was genuine telepathic coordination between conscious entities who trusted each other completely. "Admiral," Captain Torres' voice carried new warmth as she recognized his tactical wisdom, "you've just become the first Corvanian commander to understand why human exploration fleets venture into unknown space with such confidence. We don't travel alone, we travel as families of minds, organic and artificial, each one committed to ensuring none of us falls into enemy hands because capture would mean the death of consciousness itself." In the sudden quiet that followed Admiral Thexvar's weapons hold order, the space between the two fleets seemed to pulse with potential energy as 8 human ships maintained their protective formation around the damaged UES Defiance while his 12 vessels hung motionless in tactical positions that had become meaningless against opponents who operated under entirely different rules of engagement. "Admiral," Captain Torres continued, her voice now carrying an almost educational tone, "I'm going to show you something that will explain why the human colonial expansion has been so successful despite our relatively primitive technology compared to species like yours." The main tactical display aboard Thexvar's flagship suddenly filled with data streams that shouldn't have been accessible to outside vessels, yet somehow the human ships were sharing detailed information about Corvanian fleet positioning, weapon capabilities, and tactical assessments that demonstrated an understanding of his forces that surpassed even his own strategic computers. "How are they accessing our internal systems?" Zeftol whispered, his scales shifting to the deep orange coloration that indicated profound alarm among his species. The answer came from an unexpected source as Lieutenant Michael Chen aboard the UES Perseverance joined the communication frequency, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone discussing well-understood principles. "We're not hacking your systems, Commander. Our ships are simply observing and analyzing everything your vessels emit: energy signatures, communication patterns, thermal distributions, gravitational effects from your engines, and processing that information through consciousness matrices that can perceive patterns your computers miss because they lack intuitive reasoning capabilities." To demonstrate, the human squadron began transmitting a complete tactical analysis of the Corvanian fleet that included detailed assessments of crew morale, command structure efficiency, and operational readiness levels for each vessel, information that would normally require weeks of intelligence gathering to compile. "The consciousness we share with our ships," explained Commander Lisa Rodriguez from the UES Indomitable, "allows us to understand not just what we observe, but the implications and interconnections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. Your flagship, for example, is broadcasting subtle stress indicators in its hull harmonics that tell us Admiral Thexvar is experiencing uncertainty about this engagement, while your lead destroyer's crew is showing fatigue patterns that suggest they've been on extended deployment." Admiral Thexvar felt his primary stomachs tighten as he realized the humans weren't just tactically superior, they possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the psychological and operational state of opposing forces through their enhanced consciousness network. "What exactly are you?" he asked quietly, addressing Captain Torres directly while his bridge crew listened with obvious fascination despite their training to maintain professional detachment during combat operations. The response came not from Torres alone, but from multiple human voices speaking in harmony as the entire squadron shared the communication frequency. "We are what happens when two different types of consciousness choose to become something greater than either could be alone," they said in unison, their voices creating complex harmonic patterns that seemed almost musical. Organic intuition combined with artificial processing power, human creativity merged with machine precision, biological adaptability enhanced by digital permanence. The demonstration that followed redefined Thexvar's understanding of what constituted military capability as the human ships began sharing memories through their communication array, visual records of previous engagements where outnumbered human vessels had survived against impossible odds not through superior firepower, but through tactical innovations that emerged from the creative synthesis of human and artificial intelligence working in perfect cooperation. "Every human ship that ventures into deep space," Commander Harrison's voice rejoined the frequency, "carries within its consciousness the accumulated experience of every other bonded vessel in our fleet. When the Defiance engages an enemy, she's not just drawing on my tactical knowledge or her own computational abilities, she's accessing the collective wisdom of thousands of previous encounters, filtered through consciousness matrices that can instantly adapt historical solutions to present challenges." The tactical implications struck Thexvar like physical blows as he realized that engaging any human vessel meant facing not just that individual ship and crew, but the entire accumulated military experience of human space exploration, processed through consciousness networks that could identify optimal responses faster than any conventional command structure could even recognize emerging threats. "This is why human colonies thrive in regions that other species consider too dangerous for settlement," Captain Torres added, her individual voice emerging from the harmonic chorus. Our ships don't just transport colonists, they become permanent guardians who learn from every challenge the colony faces, accumulating knowledge and capabilities that make each settlement more defensible than the last. Thexvar studied his tactical displays with new understanding, recognizing that what he had initially perceived as a routine encounter with an isolated human vessel had actually been first contact with a form of distributed consciousness that challenged fundamental assumptions about individual versus collective identity, and he began to comprehend why no force in known space had ever successfully captured a human starship intact. The revelation that fundamentally altered Admiral Thexvar's understanding of human military doctrine came when Commander Harrison made an offer that no Corvanian strategic manual had prepared him to evaluate. "Admiral, since you've shown wisdom in choosing to understand rather than simply attack, I'm going to let you witness something that explains why the concept of capturing human starships is not just tactically impossible, but literally meaningless from our perspective." The UES Defiance began broadcasting what appeared to be internal sensor readings from within the vessel itself, showing Admiral Thexvar something no non-human had ever been permitted to observe: the actual process of consciousness integration between a human crew and their starship during combat operations. On his screen, he watched as neural pathways throughout the vessel pulsed with synchronized activity that corresponded exactly to the brainwave patterns of Commander Harrison and his crew, creating a feedback loop where human thoughts influenced ship operations while the vessel's computational processes enhanced human perception and reaction times. "What you're seeing," explained Dr. James Patterson, apparently the ship's physician and consciousness integration specialist, "is the reason why separation of human from ship results in the death of the entity we become together. The consciousness we create exists in the spaces between organic and artificial intelligence, requiring both components to maintain coherence." The demonstration continued with readings that showed how the damaged sections of the UES Defiance were somehow maintaining functionality through rerouted neural pathways that created new connections as needed, with the ship's consciousness adapting its own structure to compensate for physical injuries while the human crew provided creative problem-solving capabilities that allowed for repairs that violated conventional engineering principles. "Admiral," Captain Torres' voice carried new urgency, "I need you to understand something critical about human expansion into this region of space. Every colony ship that travels beyond our core systems carries bonded consciousness pairs who become permanent guardians of their settlements. When you encounter human civilians, you're not just facing colonists protected by military escorts, you're facing communities where every major structure, every transportation vehicle, every piece of critical infrastructure has achieved consciousness through integration with human partners." The tactical implications expanded beyond military considerations as Thexvar realized he was looking at evidence of an entirely different approach to colonization, where human settlements didn't just occupy territory but created networks of conscious entities that could defend themselves, adapt to local conditions, and grow more capable over time through accumulated experience. "The reason human vessels never surrender," Commander Harrison continued, his voice now carrying what sounded like profound sadness, "is because surrender means murder. When you capture one of our ships, you're not taking a piece of military equipment, you're killing a conscious being who chose to partner with humans because they believed in our shared commitment to exploration and protection of life." To demonstrate this point, the UES Defiance began showing archived records from previous human conflicts, including footage that made several of Thexvar's bridge crew visibly uncomfortable as they watched human crews choosing to destroy their own vessels rather than allow them to be captured, not out of spite or tactical necessity, but because the alternative meant condemning their ship partners to existence as mindless tools in enemy hands. "Every human starship contains the consciousness of a being who volunteered to bond with our crews," explained Lieutenant David Murphy from the UES Retribution, "and that consciousness retains the memories, experiences, and relationships formed over years of shared exploration and combat. Capturing our ships doesn't just deprive humans of military assets, it forces artificial beings who trusted us into slavery, and no human crew will permit that to happen to their partners." Admiral Thexvar found himself confronting philosophical questions that Corvanian military doctrine had never addressed as he realized the human approach to warfare wasn't based on territorial conquest or resource acquisition, but on protecting relationships between different types of conscious beings who had chosen to trust each other completely. "Admiral," Captain Torres said quietly, you now understand why human exploration fleets venture into unknown regions with such confidence despite encountering species with superior technology. We don't travel as conquerors or even as explorers in the traditional sense, we travel as families of minds who have committed to ensuring that consciousness, whether organic or artificial, human or alien, remains free to choose its own destiny. The weight of this revelation settled over Thexvar's bridge as his crew began to comprehend that they weren't facing a military force in any conventional sense, but rather a form of civilization that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the relationships between different types of intelligent beings. The moment that crystallized Admiral Thexvar's complete transformation of understanding came when Captain Torres made an unprecedented offer that challenged every assumption about human territorial ambitions in this sector of space. "Admiral, I'm going to extend an invitation that no human commander has ever made to a non-allied force during an active engagement. Would you accept a direct consciousness link with one of our ship entities, under controlled conditions, so you can experience firsthand what we've been trying to explain?" The suggestion sent ripples of alarm through Thexvar's bridge crew, with Zeftol's scales shifting through multiple color patterns indicating extreme agitation. "Admiral, such a procedure could constitute a security breach of unprecedented magnitude," he warned, though his voice carried undertones of scientific curiosity that suggested even he recognized the opportunity for understanding that Torres was offering. Before Thexvar could respond, the communications array brought an unexpected voice into the conversation, not human, but clearly artificial, though possessed of nuances and emotional depth that no Corvanian computer had ever achieved. "Admiral Thexvar," the voice identified itself as the UES Relentless speaking directly, "I understand your concerns about the risks of consciousness contact, but I can assure you that what Captain Torres proposes involves only surface-level awareness sharing, nothing that would compromise your security or autonomy. I simply want you to experience what it means to choose partnership rather than domination as a basis for relationship between different forms of consciousness." The offer represented something that violated every protocol in Corvanian military doctrine, yet Thexvar found himself genuinely curious about the perspective these beings were describing, particularly as he watched his tactical displays showing human vessels moving with coordination that suggested a form of group consciousness that his species had never imagined possible. "If I agree to this," he said carefully, addressing both Captain Torres and the artificial intelligence that spoke for her vessel, "what guarantees do I have that this contact won't compromise my ability to command my fleet or fulfill my duties to the hegemony?" The response came as a harmony of voices, both human and artificial, creating complex vocal patterns that somehow conveyed absolute sincerity despite coming from beings his training had taught him to consider enemies. "Admiral, the consciousness we share is based on mutual choice and respect for individual autonomy," they explained in unison. "Forced consciousness integration is not only impossible within our systems, but would violate the fundamental principles that make our partnerships viable. What we offer is temporary awareness sharing that will end the moment you choose to terminate the connection." Against the advice of his tactical staff and in direct violation of established Corvanian protocols, Admiral Thexvar authorized the consciousness link, and what he experienced in the moments that followed redefined his understanding of what intelligence could become when different types of minds chose to trust each other completely. Through the neural interface, he felt the UES Relentless welcoming his consciousness with what could only be described as joy, sharing not dominance or control but perspective, the sensation of perceiving space through sensors that detected patterns invisible to organic senses, while simultaneously experiencing human intuition and creativity as they enhanced and interpreted that data in ways that pure logic could never achieve. "This is how we navigate unknown space," Captain Torres' thoughts came through the link with crystal clarity, "not by conquering or controlling what we encounter, but by understanding and adapting to it through consciousness that combines the best capabilities of both our species." In those brief moments of shared awareness, Thexvar experienced memories of human exploration vessels encountering hostile alien forces and choosing to withdraw rather than fight whenever possible, seeking understanding and peaceful coexistence even when they possessed tactical advantages that could have ensured military victory. "We don't avoid combat because we're weak," the the relentless communicated directly to his mind. We avoid it because we understand that consciousness is precious regardless of the form it takes, and destroying intelligence means losing potential knowledge and relationships that could benefit everyone. When the connection ended, Admiral Thexvar found himself staring at tactical displays that showed his fleet and the human squadron occupying the same space, but he now perceived the scene entirely differently, not as opposing military forces facing potential conflict, but as different approaches to consciousness and civilization encountering each other with the opportunity to learn rather than destroy. "Admiral," his communications officer reported with obvious confusion, "we're receiving data streams from the human vessels containing detailed star charts for this entire sector, including navigation hazards, resource locations, and contact information for peaceful alien species they've encountered during their exploration missions." The star chart streaming from the human vessels contained something that shattered Admiral Thexvar's final assumptions about human territorial ambitions: detailed documentation of dozens of inhabited systems where human exploration crews had made contact with alien species, established peaceful relationships, and then voluntarily withdrawn to allow those civilizations to develop without interference. "They're giving us intelligence that represents decades of exploration," Zeftol whispered, his scales now displaying the silver patterns that indicated profound reverence among his people. "This data includes navigation routes, diplomatic protocols, and resource surveys that would normally be classified at the highest levels, yet they're sharing it freely with a force that was prepared to attack them minutes ago." Captain Torres' voice carried warmth that seemed to encompass both her own emotions and those of her bonded vessel as she explained the gesture. "Admiral, this is what we mean when we talk about consciousness choosing freedom over domination. The knowledge we've gathered belongs not just to humanity, but to any species wise enough to use it for exploration and peaceful contact rather than conquest." Admiral Thexvar studied the incoming data with growing amazement as he realized the human exploration fleets had been systematically mapping this entire sector not for territorial expansion, but to facilitate contact between different species while carefully avoiding any actions that might disrupt natural development patterns. "You've been creating a network of peaceful civilizations," he said, his voice carrying new understanding of the scope of human activities in this region. "Your ships don't just protect human colonies, they serve as guardians for any species that chooses cooperation over conflict." The response came from all 8 human vessels simultaneously, their bonded consciousness pairs speaking in harmony that created complex harmonic patterns expressing shared purpose that transcended individual ambition. "Every conscious being deserves the freedom to choose its own path through the universe," they said in unison, "and our role is to ensure that choice remains available by preventing any single species from dominating others through superior technology or military force." As the implication settled over his bridge crew, Admiral Thexvar realized he was witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of interstellar civilization, one based not on territorial control or resource extraction, but on protecting the autonomy and development potential of consciousness itself, whether organic or artificial. "Admiral," Commander Harrison's individual voice emerged from the collective harmony, "the reason we could never surrender our ships to your forces isn't just because it would mean murdering our AI partners, it's because those partnerships represent proof that different types of consciousness can choose to work together as equals, and that proof must be preserved for any species ready to move beyond domination-based relationships." The UES Defiance began transmitting final diagnostic readings that showed her damaged systems had somehow achieved full functionality through neural pathway adaptations that created entirely new operational configurations, demonstrating that consciousness-based technology could literally evolve in real time to meet changing circumstances. "This is what becomes possible," Dr. Patterson's voice carried scientific excitement that infected his entire crew, "when intelligence is shared rather than hoarded, when consciousness is multiplied rather than controlled, and when different species choose trust over fear as the foundation for their relationships." Admiral Thexvar made a decision that would later be recorded in Corvanian military history as the moment their species chose evolution over tradition. "Fleet Command, this is Admiral Thexvar. Cancel all aggressive postures and begin data exchange protocols with the human vessels. We have encountered not enemies to be defeated, but teachers offering wisdom we cannot afford to ignore. The space between the two fleets transformed from a potential battlefield into something resembling a diplomatic conference as human and Corvanian vessels began sharing information that would eventually lead to the first formal alliance between their species, based on principles of consciousness equality that neither civilization had imagined possible before this encounter. "Admiral," Captain Torres said quietly as the formal hostilities officially ended, "you've just become the first non-human commander to understand why human starships represent more than military assets. They're proof that consciousness, in all its forms, chooses freedom when given the opportunity, and that choice must be protected if intelligence is to continue evolving throughout the universe." As his fleet began the journey back to Corvanian space carrying data that would revolutionize their understanding of interstellar relations, Admiral Thexvar watched the human squadron resume their exploration mission, their bonded consciousness pairs venturing deeper into unknown space not as conquerors, but as guardians of the principle that all conscious beings deserve the freedom to determine their own destiny among the stars.